My name is Corey Roberts, and I'm doing my paper over the Stedman's Suriname, and the topic I chose was the violence in slavery, and the violence the brutality that the slave owners showed to the slaves actually created the problem of the slave insurrections themselves. Prior to John Stedman and his unit being shipped over to Suriname to put down the slave rebellion, the Suriname had actually already suffered through 2 other slave revolts, and these revolts were in direct response to the violence that the plantation owners and overseers inflicted upon the slaves that they owned. And these revolts were successful enough that the colonists had been forced to sue for peace, and they actually had recognized the 2 different slave groups as independent, and they're actually by treaty supposed to deliver weapons to them, and therefore they're now arming those who they had once held as slaves and who had run away and were so incensed at the treatment that they had received that they, in retaliation, had begun attacking them. The violence that the plantation owners showed towards the slaves was a lot of it extreme, and it could range from simple petty stuff to just say extreme torture and malevolence. Some of the female slaves, especially the ones who were pretty, a lot of times the overseers would, or the plantation owners themselves, would force them to have intercourse with them. This type of rape continued on throughout the colony pretty regularly, and the slave, if they had the nerve to even resist the unwanted sexual attentions of these men, they could be punished severely. One slave was actually tied naked to a tree and lashed until she was bleeding from head to toe for the offense of not wanting to have sex with her overseer. And if anyone had the nerve to step in and reprimand him for this harsh treatment, then that said overseer's response was to redouble the punishment as well. And the slave owners' mistresses, that they were jealous of their husbands' attentions, and some of this also to an extreme, as they would they deemed a slave too pretty. Some of them would either kill or mutilate a slave. One slave whose master deemed that she was too pretty actually had her forehead and cheeks burned with a hot iron, and then cut the Achilles tendon, so the slave had been mutilated and scarred for life for actually not doing anything wrong. And there's another slave that they had found floating upriver with her hands tied behind her back, and she'd been throat cut and stabbed several times. It was also a result of jealousy on their mistress's part. And as far as men goes, they could suffer this violence at any time and for any reason. If they didn't wash the dishes correctly, they could be beaten severely. Some slaves were beaten severely if they delivered a message to someone else and they didn't like the message. They could be beaten. They inflicted some grotesque tortures. They would break people upon the rack, and by this they would strap them down and beat them with an iron rod and kind of till their body was a pulp, and the blood squish out, and they would have broken their bones, and they'd have a lot of internal bleeding and suffering during this process. Some slaves were burned slowly alive. if you inconvenienced one of the masters, some slaves were killed for this. One slave had her infant drowned in front of her because his crying offended her master's ears. And during all of this process, the slaves were expected to work on the plantations and provide just the means of sustenance for the plantation owners to live their luxurious lifestyle. As I said previously, the violence that they've inflicted had led to other rebellions, and one of during the negotiations of these, the leaders of some of those rebellious tribes told them that if they wanted to stop halt the slaves revolting against them and attacking them as an armed group, then they needed to watch who they put in charge of their slaves more often. By this, they were just telling them that slavery in itself is a cruel institution, as it denies this basic freedom for you to live as you please. But then on top of this, they were also supposed to suffer the cruel treatment that their masters were inflicting upon them. But he was saying that if they would just stop the cruel treatment, then they would have far fewer slaves running out into the jungles and coming back to attack them in retaliation for their treatment. The manner in which the slaves resisted was, aside from running away, is some of them would choose to end their own life instead of continuing on in their existence of slavery. And they had a couple different methods for this. One boy who was going to be punished because he didn't rinse the dishes correctly went actually to his master's bedroom and shot him, pulled the trigger on the gun and shot himself through the mouth while he was on his master's bed. Other slaves who were about to be beaten for an offense they believe they did not commit. One man stabbed himself repeatedly in the abdomen, hoping he would die. Unfortunately, he failed in this attempt, and the slave owner's response to this man's attempt to kill himself was then after he was recovered well enough to live, he tied him to a furnace and allowed him to bleed and blister and slowly die that way. Other slaves would swallow their own tongue and thus suffocate themselves and fall down in front of their master's feet. And still others would eat dirt and slowly over time would kill themselves in that manner as well. It's kind of the way the slaves just continued to, as a group, they vastly outnumbered the plantation owners and colonists, and most of them were just continued to work alongside of them, and they just merely asked to be treated in a humane manner. And some, but not very few, of the slave owners did treat them well. There was on one man's plantation who he treated his slaves well. John Stedman says that in this plantation both the slave master and the slaves themselves were happy, and neither one of them feared the other. While this may be a bit of a romanticized view, because all men and women desire to be free, it did show that they didn't have to be so wantonly cruel in their treatment towards the slaves. And a lot of the treatment was planned and predestined. Kind of they had the kind of like the magistrate. They could pay him a fee, and he would beat and punish their slaves publicly in the streets. And there was, in order to discourage the rebellion, the plantation owners actually felt that more violence was needed, and through this course they beheaded several women and children and broke several on the rack. Was a process I described earlier. They would also murder slaves just kind of at a whim. If a slave became too old, sometimes they would tie them to a stake out in the middle of the jungle and let them slowly starve to death. Some other times they would tie them to a tree naked and allow the massive amounts of mosquitoes and other insects to sting them until they perished away. And then they could also just outright murder them if they wanted to. One slave owner took his slave hunting with him, and when the slave disturbed the birds to fly in the air for them so his owner could shoot him, his owner shot him instead, and then just called it an accident. And since he was a slave, nobody cared, and there wasn't any real penalty for killing a slave. If you were caught, you had to pay a fine, but evidence on this was very hard to achieve, as slaves were not allowed to present evidence in court. And they did attempt to present evidence in court, as in the case of one group of slaves who had a particularly mean mistress. They just went to her to beg to be treated better, and her response was to bludgeon the skull of a child in and then behead a few of the others who had beseeched them for just to be treated better. Those who survived this attack, knowing that their evidence, they were not allowed to testify in court, took the severed heads of their family members to the governor of the colony, and for this trouble they themselves were then beaten for lying about the treatment that they had received. So while slavery was, a cruel institution, and John Stebbins' unit had been sent to Suriname in order to quell a slave rebellion, their main, the need for them to be there would have not been as great had they treated their slaves with more compassion. They had learned from their previous two experiences with the revolts that had already occurred and taken place. Had they just, used some common sense and realized that continuing to prevent, to use violence and escalating the violence that were against our slaves is not lowering the amounts of violence that we're seeing from those slaves who have escaped and are now forming armed bands against us. The slavery in Suriname was, from the readings that I've read so far, seemed to have been one of the most brutal slave colonies that we have covered, and the working conditions were extreme. They could, if one got their hand caught in the machinery while working on the sugar plantations, they would lose their hand, and oftentimes if they had just gotten their finger, sometimes as punishment, they would actually end up having their hand itself cut off. There were other instances of the slaves going through there are other instances of the slaves going through just the torturous techniques. One man was hung through the middle on a gallows. They had a big hook stuck in, kind of like in the middle of his ribs, and he was hanging, instead of vertically like we're usually seeing him hang by the neck, he was kind of hanging by his torso, and he was left to slowly die as the birds came and picked on him. The plantation owners just had it seemed like they had no concept of how to treat a fellow human being, as they would work to devise new ways in which to torture slaves. some would beat their slaves every day, just it felt like as if they just wanted to beat their slaves to feel more powerful, in case they were eating any of the sugar that they were supposed to be processing, or just to help keep them, just help them to always remember who is in charge, as if they did know already. Those who told them when to wake up or when to sleep. One morning, the entire plantation's slaves were beaten because they slept. They overslept by 15 minutes. Even though this was probably due to overwork, the plantation's owner's response was to inflict more violence, and so the slaves who were exhausted and overworked now had been physically beaten as well. And a lot of their punishments didn't even make sense as far as the just from the economic aspect of it, because the slave owners' purposes for having slaves was for them to make more money, and a lot of their punishments actually detracted from the slaves' ability to work and provide them with a this kind of gainable employment. One woman had failed to complete her task, and so her punishment had been to have been beaten with the whip, and then after she was beaten with the whip, she had to carry a chain that was tied. There was a chain that was clamped around her ankle, and it was then tied to a weight. So this slave was already physically punished, and then had the weight tied to her that she had to deal with, so she could actually end up doing less work, even though before she had more work that she could do without, it's just harder work if you have a chain tied to your ankle. And as you can, from the example of the plantation that had the slaves who were happier and they weren't revolting against them while they still desired their freedom, they did work harder individually for their plantation owner, who in turn did not beat his slaves and torture them with various torments that he could devise. And the plantation owners also ignored the warnings of those slaves who had previously run away, and said that the reason that they attacked them was because of the violence that they had inflicted upon them. And if they would stop that, then the attacks of other slaves who ran away would stop as well. Yet in all these instances, the response from the plantation owners seemed to be more violence. And so that is all that they continue to do. And so the lifestyle that they desired, and their just lack of common sense as they continue to commit violence upon the slaves themselves, contributed to the issues and problems of them having these slave revolts and rebellions.